Tonight, if the sky is clear, somebody will be standing at a wooden overlook in the Blue Ridge foothills of North Carolina, leaning on the railing, watching a long dark ridge called Brown Mountain, and waiting for it to light up. People have been doing exactly this for more than 100 years. They pull off the highway at a place called Wiseman's View, or at the overlook on Highway 181, and they wait. And sometimes, not on schedule and not on demand, a light appears over the ridge. It rises, it hangs there, it glows, sometimes white, sometimes red or blue, and then it fades, and the people at the railing go very quiet, and then they start arguing about what they just saw. That is happening in our own time, this year, on clear nights. And the thing you will hear, almost every single time, from the roadside plaque and the guidebook, and the stranger standing next to you at the railing, is that the Cherokee watched these same lights long before any settler ever climbed up to that overlook. That is the claim I want to walk into slowly, because it sits on top of two completely different kinds of record, and almost everybody who tells this story mashes them into one. On one side, there is a real, documented natural event, a thing people genuinely see over a real mountain, a thing the United States Geological Survey thought worth investigating, twice, with train schedules and survey telescopes. On the other side, there is Cherokee oral tradition, the stories a living people told about the lights in their own dark, written down by a man named James Mooney and printed by the Smithsonian in the year 1900. Both of those records are real. They are not the same record, and the honest way to tell this is to hold them in two separate hands and to mark the line out loud every single time we cross from one to the other. So that is what we are going to do here. I am going to name the records early, because naming the record is the whole trust of a story like this one. The tradition comes from James Mooney, his book Myths of the Cherokee, that same 1900 report. The phenomenon comes from the Geological Survey, an early look in 1913, and a careful one by a geologist named George Rogers Mansfield in 1922. Hold both of those in your head. Because when we finally open Mooney's book, more than 500 pages of Cherokee tradition, and we go through it looking for Brown Mountain, something happens that almost none of the guidebooks will tell you about. Let me set the mountain itself in front of you first, because the place is real and ordinary, and that turns out to matter. Brown Mountain is a long, low, wooded ridge in Burke County, North Carolina, up in the foothills north of the town of Morganton, inside the edge of the Pisgah National Forest, and its crest reaches only about 2,600 feet. It is not the dramatic peak the stories might lead you to picture. It is the kind of ridge you would drive straight past without a second glance if nobody had ever handed you a story about it. There is no summit to climb, no dramatic cliff, nothing that looks like the setting for a mystery. It is just a dark line of trees against the sky after the sun goes down. And that is exactly the point, because the lights do not come from anything you can see up on the ridge in daylight. People report them after dark. Small, round, glowing lights that seem to lift up off or just above the ridgeline, float, hover, sometimes drift sideways, sometimes split in two, sometimes pulse and change color, and then simply wink out. Some nights nothing happens at all. That unreliability is part of why the thing has held people's attention for a century, and it is also, as we are going to see, part of why it has been so slippery to pin down. For right now, I only want you to hold the plain physical picture. A real ridge. A real place you can drive to this weekend. And real lights that real people, across many years and many temperaments, have stood at that railing and seen. That is the phenomenon. Keep it in your right hand. We are about to pick up something very different in the left, but not yet. It is worth saying plainly how many different kinds of people have stood at that railing over the years, because the phenomenon does not seem to care who is watching. Farmers and fishermen reported the lights first. Then came newspapermen, and after them federal geologists, and after them state officials, and eventually whole busloads of ordinary tourists following the brown highway signs to the marked overlooks. The state of North Carolina put up viewing areas. Guidebooks began listing the best nights and the best angles to catch them. And across all those decades of watchers, the descriptions stayed strangely consistent, and strangely varied at the very same time. A single glowing ball, some said, about the size of a soap bubble held at arm's length, rising slowly off the ridge and hanging there a moment before it burst and vanished. Others described a light that slid along the ridgeline, or several lights at once, or a glow that swelled and faded like a slow heartbeat. The colors ranged from a pale white through yellow and red to, every so often, a strange cold blue. Some of the witnesses were skeptics who drove up to debunk the thing and went home unsettled. Others were believers who saw exactly what they had come to see. That mixture, the sameness of the basic report and the wildness of the variation in the detail, is the fingerprint of a real but elusive thing, and it is exactly what has kept serious people coming back to Brown Mountain with instruments for a full century. Here is the first place where the popular story and the actual paper trail come apart. If you read almost anything about Brown Mountain, you will be told that the lights were first written down in the year 1771 by a German engineer named John William Gerard de Brom, who supposedly recorded them in his journal. It is a lovely, specific, old-sounding date, and it hands the whole legend a colonial pedigree. The problem is that it does not survive being checked. De Brom did write about the southern mountains, but the passage everyone points to is a general explanation of thunderstorms and the behavior of mountain air, full of talk about vapors and sublimations, and it does not mention Brown Mountain at all. There is no good evidence that de Brom ever set foot in North Carolina. When researchers traced the story of his supposed sighting back to its own root, they found that the link between his 18th century words and this particular ridge was first made much later, in a North Carolina newspaper item in the 1920s. So the famous 1771 first sighting is itself a 20th century invention, glued onto an old document that was actually talking about the weather. I dwell on this one because it is a perfect small example of the thing this whole video is about. A modern claim gets dressed in an antique date, and then it gets repeated so many times that it starts to feel like bedrock. So where does the real, checkable record actually begin? It begins, without any romance at all, in local newspapers in the 1910s. The first solid, traceable printed mentions of strange lights around Brown Mountain are short pieces in western North Carolina papers from that decade, and the moment the thing really breaks into public view is September of 1913, when members of a group called the Morganton Fishing Club had been talking about a peculiar light often enough that the Charlotte Daily Observer sent a reporter up to look into it. That is the honest starting line of the documented phenomenon, a fishing club and a newspaper reporter in 1913, with nothing colonial or ancient about it. And I want you to hold that year, because in that very same year the lights got their first scientist. When the newspaper attention hit in 1913, it reached the federal government, and the Geological Survey sent a man named D.B. Sterrett out to Brown Mountain to find out what people were seeing. Sterrett did something simple and sensible. He looked at where along the ridge the lights appeared, and he looked hard at the valley below, and he compared the times the lights were reported against the schedules of the trains running through that valley. And he came back with an answer that was almost insultingly plain. The lights, he concluded, were the headlights of locomotives, specifically, westbound trains of the Southern Railway, swinging around the curves down in the Catawba Valley, threw their headlamps up toward the ridge in a way that would have been perfectly visible from the porches and hotels where people gathered to watch. That was the first official verdict on the mystery of Brown Mountain: trains. A man with a train schedule had, apparently, solved it inside a single year. And that answer might have quietly held, except that 3 years later the valley itself did something nobody had arranged, and it pulled the train explanation apart at the seam. In July of 1916, a tremendous flood came down through the mountains of western North Carolina. Days of heavy rain sent the rivers over their banks, and along the Catawba and its tributaries, the water tore out bridges and washed away long stretches of railroad track. For several weeks after that flood, the trains through the valley below Brown Mountain simply stopped running. There were no locomotives coming around the curves, no headlamps swinging up at the ridgeline, because there were no trains at all. And during those weeks, according to people who lived there, the lights over the ridge kept right on appearing. A hotel owner named G.A. Lovin, whose place had become one of the main spots where people gathered to watch, was among those who said the lights had gone on, showing themselves the whole time the railroad lay dead. You can feel immediately why that became the beating heart of the legend. If the lights were only train headlights, and the trains were gone, and the lights stayed, then the simple answer was wrong, and the mystery was real after all. That argument, the trains stopped and the lights did not, has been repeated for 100 years now, and I understand exactly why. It is clean, it is dramatic, and it feels like proof you can hold. I have to be straight with you about that argument though, because keeping the record honest has to cut in both directions. not just the direction we like. By 1916, the thing that had changed in that valley was not only the railroad. The automobile had arrived. Cars were beginning to run the roads along the base of the mountains, and a car headlight thrown up at a ridge in the dark looks a great deal like a train headlight thrown up at a ridge in the dark. So the fact that the lights outlasted the trains in that flood year genuinely wounds the pure train theory, and it deserves to. But it does not by itself prove that the lights are unexplainable, because the valley by then had filled with a brand new source of moving light that nobody was subtracting. That is precisely the sort of distinction the legend tends to glide right over, and it is precisely the sort of distinction the next investigation was built to catch. By the early 1920s, Brown Mountain had become a genuine national curiosity, and the story had outgrown the valley entirely. The lights were written up in big city newspapers. People wrote letters to the government demanding an explanation. The Smithsonian and the Geological Survey were both pulled into the correspondence, and the pressure was not coming from cranks alone. Respectable citizens, including people who had watched the ridge patiently for years, were insisting that something up there had never been properly accounted for, and that the quick railroad answer of 1913 had been discredited by the flood. What strikes me, looking back, is how reasonable that demand actually was. The public wanted the government to come back and do the job right, with better tools, now that the easy answer had failed. That is a reasonable thing to want, and it has nothing to do with believing in ghosts. And to the real credit of the survey, that is exactly what they did. They did not wave the thing away from a desk in Washington. They sent a geologist back to the mountain to stand out in the dark and measure it. That is how 1922 became the year the lights finally met their most serious investigator. That next investigation is the reason we can talk about any of this as something sturdier than a campfire story. The Geological Survey sent the geologist George Rogers Mansfield back to Brown Mountain, and Mansfield did not glance at it and leave. He spent about 2 weeks in the area. He set up several observing stations, including one near Lovin's Hotel, the very gathering spot where so many people had stood and watched. And most importantly, he brought a proper instrument, an alidad, which is a surveying telescope mounted so that you can read the exact direction, the exact angle, to anything you sight through it. Every time a light appeared, Mansfield could take a precise bearing on it, a hard compass direction, and then lay that bearing against his map of the valley to see what actually sat out there along that line. That is the entire difference between a person at a railing saying it came from the mountain and a trained observer being able to say that light is sitting on the exact bearing as the automobile road, or the rail line, or a particular farmhouse, several miles out in the valley. And when Mansfield worked through all of his readings, the great run of the lights sorted themselves out into ordinary sources. Close to half of the lights he studied lined up with automobile headlights down in the valley. About a third of them lined up with the headlights of locomotives. And essentially all of the rest matched stationary lights, house lamps and the like, or brush fires burning in the low country below the ridge. His conclusion, in the plainest possible words, was that the Brown Mountain lights were, as he put it, clearly not of unusual nature or origin. What people were seeing over that ridge, in the overwhelming run of cases, was the ordinary nighttime light of a valley that had steadily filled up with cars and trains and lamps, carried up to the crest, and made strange by distance and by the moist mountain air, which can bend and lift a far-off light until it looks like it is floating free of the earth. That was the survey's answer, and in its broad shape it has held ever since. Now I want to be careful about how I say this next part, because this is exactly the spot where a lazier telling reaches for a villain. There was no cover-up here. Mansfield was not dispatched to make the lights go away. He was a careful man with a telescope, doing careful work in a valley, and what he produced is the record doing precisely its job, which is to tell you the plain truth even when the plain truth is quieter than the legend. The genuine mystery that survives Mansfield is a small one, a residue, the handful of reports that do not tuck neatly behind a car or a train, and we will come back to that residue near the end, because modern cameras went looking for it, and what they found is worth your patience. It helps to understand why Brown Mountain in particular makes such a perfect stage for this kind of illusion, because the geography does half the work for you. You have a long, low ridge with a broad, settled valley spread out behind it, and the people watching are themselves standing on higher ground at the overlooks, looking out across a gap of several miles. A light down in that far valley, a car cresting a rise, A locomotive on a curve, a farmhouse lamp, does not announce its distance to your eye in the dark. Strip away all the daytime cues, the trees and fields and roads that would tell your brain how far off a thing really is, and a light 4 or 5 miles away can seem to hang just above the near ridge, cut loose from any source, floating. Add to that the genuine optical behavior of air over mountains, where layers of warm and cool air can bend a beam of light, make it shimmer, split it in two, or lift its apparent position off the true one, and you have every single ingredient you need to turn the ordinary night traffic of a valley into a slow procession of mystery lights. You do not need anybody to be lying or drunk or foolish for any of this to happen. It only requires the dark, the distance, and an unfamiliar sky. But we have now reached the seam, the exact line I promised we would mark out loud every time we crossed it. Everything up to this sentence, the ridge, the newspapers, De Brom, Sterret, the flood, Mansfield and his Aladad, all of that is the documented phenomenon, the thing in your right hand. So let me set the geologist's telescope down, very deliberately, and go get the other record, the one that is supposed to reach back long before any of these men and their instruments. To reach it honestly, we have to leave the valley entirely and open a book, and when we open it, we find the thing the guidebooks skip. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The book is James Mooney's Myths of the Cherokee. Mooney was an ethnographer for the Bureau of American Ethnology, and in the late 1880s and on through the 1890s, he lived and worked among the eastern Cherokee, sitting with storytellers and medicine keepers, learning the language, and writing down the tradition as it was given to him. The result, published by the Smithsonian in 1900, runs to more than 500 pages, and it is one of the great records of any native tradition ever assembled, because Mooney was patient and respectful, and he named his sources. If the Cherokee genuinely read the lights over Brown Mountain and told stories about them generations before any settler arrived, this book is the single most likely place in all the world for that to be written down. So I did the obvious thing. I went through it looking for Brown Mountain. And Brown Mountain is not there. The name does not appear in the book at all. There is no Cherokee-Brown Mountain battle in Mooney, no maidens with torches, no ridge of lights, nothing. The place that anchors the whole legend is simply absent from the deepest record of Cherokee tradition we have. That is the thing the roadside plaque will never tell you, and for a moment it looks as if the trail just dies right there, with a blank where the ancient legend was supposed to be. But it does not die there, because Mooney did write down something about the Cherokee, and a light in the dark. It just is not the story you have been told. What Mooney recorded is a spirit the Cherokee called Atzil-Dihiegi, which translates as the fire carrier. And here I want to slow all the way down and simply give you what the record says, in Mooney's own frame, because it is quieter and stranger, and far more human than the ghost maiden legend that replaced it. There is one spirit, Mooney wrote, that goes about at night carrying a light. The Cherokee called it the fire carrier, and they were all afraid of it, because they believed it was dangerous, and yet, he says, they did not really know much about it. They did not even know exactly what it looked like, because they were too afraid to stop and study it when they saw it. It might, Mooney adds, be a witch rather than a spirit. And then he gives you the one first-hand account he was able to gather, and it belongs to the family of one of his own informants, a Cherokee man named Wofford. Wofford's mother had seen the fire carrier once, when she was a young woman, as she was riding home at night from a trading post over in South Carolina. The light seemed to be following her from behind. She was frightened, and she whipped up her horse and rode hard until she had left it behind her, and she never saw it again. That is the whole account. A young woman, alone on a dark road, a light behind her that should not have been there, and the long ride home. Now watch what Mooney the scientist does next, because he does the exact thing we have been doing this entire time. Right there in his notes, next to the fire carrier, he adds a careful line of his own. This, he says, is probably the gaseous phenomenon known as the will-o'-the-wisp, which has been a thing of mystery and fear to others besides the Indians. In his glossary, he says it plainly, that Atzil-Dihiegi is apparently the Cherokee name for the will-o'-the-wisp. Sit with that for a second. More than a century ago, the man writing down the Cherokee tradition of a moving nightlight held the very same seam in his hands that we are holding now. In one hand, the tradition, the spirit that carries fire and follows a woman down a dark road. In the other hand, the natural phenomenon, the pale marsh light that has frightened country people on every continent. He did not collapse them into each other. He recorded the story with respect, and then he noted, separately and honestly, what the natural thing behind it probably was. That is the Cherokee reading of a light in the dark that actually exists in the record, and it is a genuinely older and deeper thing than anything about Brown Mountain, because it reaches well past any single ridge, out to the whole category of strange lights in the night, and it was already an old belief by the time Mooney wrote it down. And the fire carrier is not the only proof that the Cherokee had a rich grammar for lights that move in the dark. Mooney also records that the Cherokee had a name for a meteor, and probably for a comet as well, a name that translated as the fire panther, a great cat of flame crossing the sky. These were a people with names and stories for the fire that falls from the night, and the fire that drifts along the ground. A people whose spirit world, the immortals they called the Nunehi, was understood as something entirely distinct from the ghosts of the dead. So the deep truth underneath the title of this video is real, even though the specific legend attached to it is not. Long before the settlers, the Cherokee absolutely did read the lights of their world. They read them as the fire carrier and the fire panther. They simply did not, so far as the record can show us, read them as a battlefield full of searching maidens on a ridge in Burke County. And that gap, between the tradition they actually held and the tradition later handed to them, is the real story here. So let me show you where that famous battle legend actually comes from. You have almost certainly heard the version. The way it usually goes, around the year 1200, a great battle was fought near Brown Mountain between the Cherokee and the Catawba, two real and rival peoples of the Carolina country. And so many warriors were killed that the women, the maidens, went out afterward with pine torches to search the ridge for their dead. And the lights you see over Brown Mountain to this day are those same torches, or the spirits of those grieving women, still searching after 800 years. It is a beautiful, sorrowful story. It is put on the plaques and printed in the pamphlets, and told at the railing as the ancient Cherokee explanation, the deepest and oldest layer of the whole mystery. And when researchers connected to Appalachian State University's long study of the Brown Mountain Lights went looking for that story in the actual recorded body of Cherokee tradition, they could not find it in print anywhere before a newspaper article in the Asheville Citizen in 1938. It is absent from Mooney, and from every earlier collection of Cherokee tradition. Its earliest traceable appearance is that North Carolina newspaper in the late 1930s, which is to say it surfaces in print later than the automobile, later than Mansfield's telescope, later than the First World War. The most reasonable reading of that, and the one those researchers reached, is that the Ghost Maiden battle is very likely an invented tradition, a story shaped by later writers, many of them white, and then attributed backward onto the Cherokee, to give a modern tourist mystery an ancient and native pedigree. I want to handle that carefully, because this is the part that actually matters for a living people, and it is easy to get wrong in either direction. The Cherokee and the Catawba were and are real nations, and they genuinely were long-standing rivals whose peoples fought across the Carolina country over generations. That much is solid history. What is not solid, what appears to have no root in the pre-modern Cherokee record at all, is this specific romantic story of the year 1200 and the searching maidens as the origin of these particular lights. And there is a quiet unfairness in that, which is the ambient villain of this whole episode. When you take a pretty ghost story invented in the 20th century, pin it onto a living people, and call it their ancient legend, that does not honor them. It papers over the tradition they actually held, the fire carrier, the fire panther, the immortals in the hills, and covers it with a costume drama written by outsiders. The real Cherokee tradition of lights is more restrained, more frightening, and more honest than the tourist legend that buried it. And the tourist legend has been so much louder for so long that most people at that railing have never heard the real one. That is what forgetting really looks like. A good story quietly crowds out a true one, year after year, until the true one is gone from the plaque, and no conspiracy is needed to do it. And Brown Mountain is not alone in this, which is part of why I trust the pattern. All across the country there are scenic mysteries, glowing ghost lights and haunted rocks and bottomless lakes, that come attached to a supposedly ancient Indian legend, and a striking number of those legends turn out, whenever anyone actually checks, to have been written in English by settlers' descendants inside the past century or so. The recipe is almost always the same. Take a real natural feature, attach a doomed romance or a tragic battle, populate it with nameless braves and grieving maidens, and file the whole thing under Indian legend, which in the popular mind quietly means old, deep, and beyond question. It is worth asking why that recipe is so appealing, and I think the honest answer is a little uncomfortable. A mystery feels more legitimate, more rooted in the land, if you can claim the first peoples of that land vouched for it. Their presence gets used to certify the wonder, but the actual peoples, the Cherokee and Catawba both, are living nations with their own real and carefully recorded traditions, and those traditions never needed to be improved by a 1938 newspaper. When we let the invented legend stand in for the real one, there is nothing generous in it toward the Cherokee. It turns them into scenery for a story that was never theirs, and quietly erases the story that actually was. You can even watch the legend keep growing in modern times, right out in the open. In the mid-20th century, a North Carolina musician named Scotty Wiseman wrote a song about the Brown Mountain Light, and his song told yet another version entirely, the tale of a faithful old servant who kept climbing the mountain with a lantern, searching for a lost master, his light still swinging up there after death. That song carried the mystery to a national audience, and for a lot of people it became the story of the lights. I am not going to quote the song, but notice what it shows us. Here is a whole new legend, with a completely different cast, composed and dated and copyrighted inside living memory, and it attached itself to the same ridge just as easily as the battle story did. A real phenomenon over a real mountain works like a magnet for stories. Every generation brings its own, hangs it on the ridge, and after a while the newest coat of paint gets called the oldest. Which is exactly why the discipline of this video, holding the two records in two hands and marking the seam, is the only way I know to keep the true thing from being swallowed by the pretty thing. So let me take you back across the seam one last time, to the phenomenon, and finish where the honest mystery actually stands today, because I promised you that residue. In our own century, an astronomer at Appalachian State University, named Daniel Caton, working with a colleague named Lee Hawkins, decided to do to Brown Mountain what Mansfield could only dream of. They set up sensitive low-light cameras at two homes facing the ridge and let them photograph the mountain all night, every night, for years, so that no fleeting light would go unrecorded and no observer's excited memory would have to be trusted. And the first honest result of all that patient watching is a little deflating, and I respect it for that. By around 2014, those cameras had piled up thousands of hours of footage of the ridge, on the order of 6,000 hours, and in all of it, they had not captured a single clearly unexplainable light. Hawkins put it bluntly, that the lesson of the cameras is that you do not actually see the Brown Mountain lights, if you see them at all, very often. And Caton has been just as honest about the human side of it. Most of us, he points out, are completely unfamiliar with the real night sky now. We live indoors, under lights, in front of screens, and when such people go out and stand on a dark ridge, they are very easily fooled by ordinary things. A distant headlight, a low star, a plane, a fire, into thinking they have seen something impossible. So a great many of the sightings really are just what Mansfield said they were. And yet Caton has also been careful not to slam the door completely, because science does not get to do that either. He has described capturing, on at least one night, an odd light that he could not immediately explain away, exactly the kind of small, stubborn residue that a truly honest investigation leaves standing. So here is where it really rests, if you want the grown-up version, instead of either the debunk or the ghost story. The overwhelming majority of what people report over Brown Mountain is ordinary light from an ordinary valley, misread in the dark, precisely as the Geological Survey concluded a century ago. A small remainder has not been tidily explained, and careful people are still watching the ridge with better instruments to see whether that remainder is a real natural puzzle, some trick of atmosphere or geology, or just the last few cars and stars we have not managed to match up yet. That is not a cover-up, and it is not a haunting. It is an open, natural question, most of it answered, a little of it not, and that is a completely respectable place for a mystery to live. There is something almost moving about those cameras, if you stop and think about what they really are. For 100 years, people came to this ridge and trusted their own eyes in the dark, and their eyes, being human, handed them back 100 different stories. The cameras do not get excited. They do not want the light to be a ghost, or a maiden, or a spirit. They simply sit on the ridge, night after night after night, and record what is actually out there, and then a scientist has to look honestly at what they caught and say, most of this is nothing, and this small part of it I cannot yet explain. That is the very same discipline James Mooney showed when he wrote down the fire carrier with respect, and then quietly noted, in his own hand, what it probably was. It is the same discipline George Rogers Mansfield showed with his Aladad in 1922. Different centuries, different instruments, the same stubborn refusal to let the story outrun the evidence. That refusal is the through line of this whole account, and it is the thing I most want you to carry away from it. Which brings me back, in the end, to the two records and the honest answer to the question in the title. Did the Cherokee read the lights over Brown Mountain long before the settlers? The truest answer I can give you, after holding both records in both hands, is this. The Cherokee did read the lights of their world, long before any settler, and we know it because James Mooney sat with them and wrote it down. The fire carrier on the dark road, and the fire panther crossing the sky. A whole way of understanding the strange fires of the night that was old when it was recorded, and is genuinely theirs. What they did not leave us, in any record we are able to open, is the specific story that the settlers' descendants later carved onto Brown Mountain and handed back to them as ancient, the battle, and the torches, and the searching maidens. The lights over the ridge are real, and they are mostly explainable, and a little of them is still an honest, open question for the scientists at their cameras. The Cherokee tradition of lights is also real, and it is older and deeper than the ridge, and it deserves to be told as what it actually is, rather than as the tourist legend that grew up over it. Keeping those two things separate, and giving each one its due, is the only way I know to honor both the mountain and the people, and it is the whole reason we mark the seam. Before we close, if these old stories and the people who first wrote them down are what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos, plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access, link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end. So the next time you stand at that railing in the dark, watch for the light and enjoy the mystery of it. But when the stranger beside you calls it the ancient Cherokee battlefield, the torches of the grieving maidens, hold that story gently in one hand, and in the other, hold the quieter, truer thing that Mooney actually wrote down. A young woman on a dark road, riding hard for home, with a light behind her that should not have been there.